The old man's hands trembled as he turned the leather journal's brittle pages. Nathaniel Thornwood, 83 years old now, sat in his workshop in the year 1927, surrounded by tools he no longer had the strength to lift. The scent of wood shavings and gun oil filled the air, memories made tangible. Outside, his great-grandchildren played in the Colorado sunshine, their laughter piercing the afternoon like bells. But Nate's mind wandered backward, drawn by gravity to that autumn day in 1887, when he was 43 years old and already dead inside. His weathered fingers found the entry he sought. September 15th, 1887. The date was written in his own hand, shakier than he remembered. The ink faded to rust. Below it, a single sentence. Today, I heard a scream that changed everything. Nate closed his eyes. The workshop dissolved. The years peeled away like bark from a fallen tree, and he was there again, in the mountains, where it all began. The Sangre de Cristo range stretched across the western sky like the spine of some ancient sleeping beast. Nathaniel Thornwood moved through the pine forest with the silence of smoke, his boots finding purchase on stone and root without conscious thought. 43 years on this earth, 10 of them spent in these mountains, and his body had learned the language of wilderness the way other men learned to read. His beard, black shot through with premature gray, hung thick and untrimmed past his collarbone. Long hair, tied back with rawhide, brushed his shoulders. Scars marked his face like a map of violence survived. The deepest one ran from his left temple to his jaw, a gift from a grizzly in the winter of '79. But the deepest scars, the ones that made him choose these mountains over the company of men, those lived somewhere behind his eyes where no one could see them. He was checking his trap line, a circuit of 12 miles that took him through some of the roughest country in the Colorado Territory. Behind him, staying exactly 7 paces back as Nate had taught him, came Timothy Brennan. The boy was 12 now, growing tall and lean like a young pine. His mother had died of cholera 3 years ago. His father, a drunk, had frozen to death the following winter, a month. Nate had found Tim half-starved and wild, living in a burned-out cabin near Willow Creek. That was 2 years ago. Nate had not planned to take in a stray child, had not planned to care about another living soul ever again. But the boy had looked at him with eyes that held no hope and no fear, only a terrible emptiness that Nate recognized like his own reflection. So he had brought Tim home, taught him to trap and hunt, to read the weather and the tracks, to survive. It was not love, Nate told himself. It was simply passing on knowledge that would otherwise die with him. But in the quiet moments, when Tim laughed at something or asked a question, with genuine curiosity lighting his face, Nate felt something crack inside the ice that had encased his heart for a decade. They crossed Clearwater Creek, the water running clear and cold over smooth stones. Tim knelt to drink, cupping his hands. Nate scanned the tree line, always watching, always alert. These mountains were beautiful and they were merciless. They took the careless and they took the unlucky, and they did not care which was which. The third trap had a fox, Tim said, straightening and wiping his mouth. But something got to it before us. Bear, maybe. Big tracks. Nate nodded. He had seen the tracks too. A grizzly, likely a male, moving down from the high country as autumn deepened. In a few weeks, snow would seal these mountains tight. They would retreat to the cabin for winter, and the long dark months would begin. 10 winters Nate had endured alone before Tim. 10 winters of silence so complete it felt like drowning. They moved on. The Devil's Throat lay ahead, a narrow canyon that cut through a ridge of granite like a wound in stone. Nate avoided it when he could. Something about the place unsettled him. The way sound echoed strangely, the way birds went quiet when you entered. Old-timers said the Ute people considered it a bad place, where spirits wandered. Nate did not believe in spirits. He believed in lead and steel and the hard reality of survival. But still, he avoided the Devil's Throat. Except their route back to the cabin went directly through it, and the sun was already sliding toward the western peaks. They needed to move. Stay close, Nate said quietly. Tim nodded, his hand moving unconsciously to the knife at his belt. They entered the canyon. The walls rose on either side, sheer granite streaked with black where water had run for millennia. Overhead, a strip of sky showed deep blue. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in the shadow. Their footsteps echoed. That was when they heard it, a scream, not animal, human, female, high and desperate and filled with terror so pure it seemed to tear the air itself. Nate froze. Tim's eyes went wide. The scream came again, closer now, from somewhere ahead where the canyon widened into a grove of ponderosa pines. Every instinct Nate had honed over 43 years of staying alive told him to turn around. Walk away. Whatever was happening ahead was not his concern. He had walked away from the world 10 years ago, and the world had left him alone. But his feet were already moving. His hand found the grip of his Colt revolver without thought. Tim followed, silent as a shadow. They rounded a bend in the canyon and the grove opened before them. 6 ancient ponderosa pines stood in a rough circle, their trunks massive and scarred by lightning and time. Shafts of golden afternoon light slanted through the branches. And there, hanging upside down from the thickest branch of the largest tree, was a woman dressed in the black robes of a nun. Nate stopped so suddenly that Tim nearly collided with him. The woman's ankles were bound with manila rope, the kind the army used, tied to the branch 15 feet above the ground. Her wrists were lashed behind her back with the same rope. Her black habit had fallen toward her head, exposing her white undergarments and pale legs. Blood ran from a gash on her temple, stark against her skin. Her face was crimson from the blood pooling in her head. She was screaming at the sky as if God himself might blush and look away. Then her eyes found Nate. For a heartbeat, everything stopped. He saw her register his presence, saw shame flood her features, worse than the pain, worse than the terror. Her mouth opened, but no words came, only a choked sob. "Don't look down there," she finally gasped, her voice breaking. "That's off limits. Please, just don't look." Nate's jaw tightened. He forced his gaze to her face, only her face, though every instinct screamed at him to scan for threats, to check the surroundings, to understand what had happened here. She was young, perhaps 28, freckles across her nose and cheeks, auburn hair that had come loose from beneath her veil. Eyes blue as mountain lakes and filled with a humiliation so profound it made something twist in Nate's chest. "Tim," he said quietly, not taking his eyes off the woman. "Circle around. Tell me if you see anyone." The boy melted into the trees without a sound. Nate moved forward, his boots crunching on pine needles. He pulled his Bowie knife, 12 inches of steel he had forged himself in the fires of Tobias Greenwood's smithy. The blade caught the light. The woman flinched. "I'm not going to hurt you, sister," Nate said, his voice rough from disuse. He spoke so rarely these days that the words felt strange in his mouth. "I'm going to cut you down." "Who are you?" she whispered. "Nobody important." He reached the tree and studied the rope. Professional knots, military precise, tied not just to restrain but to hurt. Whoever had done this knew what they were doing and had wanted her to suffer. Rage, cold and familiar, stirred in Nate's belly. He began to climb. The rough bark bit into his palms. The Sharp's rifle slung across his back shifted with his movement. 20 seconds and he was level with the branch where the rope was secured. Below, the woman had stopped struggling, conserving her strength. Smart. "What's your name?" Nate asked as he worked the blade under the rope. "Sister Agnes," she said. Then, after a pause, "Sister Agnes Moreau." The French surname, not common in these mountains. "Well, Sister Agnes," Nate said, sawing through the thick manila fibers, "this is going to hurt when I drop you. But I won't drop you. I'll lower you down." "You don't have to do this," she said, but her voice held desperate hope. "Yes," Nate said quietly. "I do." The rope parted. Nate caught the loose end and wrapped it quickly around his forearm, taking the woman's weight. She was lighter than he expected, perhaps 110 pounds. The rope bit into his skin, but he held steady. Hand over hand, he lowered her. The rope creaked against the branch. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the mountain cold. When she was 3 feet from the ground, he said, "Brace yourself." Then he dropped the last length of rope. She landed hard but rolled instinctively, minimizing the impact. Good reflexes. This woman had some training. Nate descended quickly, dropping the last 8 feet and landing in a crouch. He moved to her side and cut the ropes binding her wrists and ankles. The moment she was free, Agnes scrambled backward, yanking her habit down to cover her exposed legs. Her hands shook as she tried to smooth the fabric. to restore some measure of dignity. Nate turned away, giving her privacy. "Thank you," she whispered. The words came thick with emotion. Before Nate could respond, Tim emerged from the trees, his young face pale. "Nate," the boy said urgently. "Riders, coming from the north, maybe half a mile out." Nate's hand went to his revolver. He looked at Agnes. "Who's hunting you, sister?" She met his eyes, and in that moment, Nate saw something that made his blood run cold. Not just fear, not just pain, guilt. The kind of guilt that came from witnessing something terrible. "The law," she said simply. Then hoofbeats echoed through the canyon. The sharp crack of branches breaking under horses' hooves. The jingle of cavalry tack, unmistakable to anyone who had served. 7 riders burst into the grove. They wore the blue uniforms of the United States Cavalry, though something about them struck Nate as wrong immediately. The uniforms were clean, too clean for men who had been riding hard. The brass buttons gleamed, no trail dust, no signs of a long patrol. The lead rider was a man in his early 50s, broad-shouldered and straight-backed, with a handlebar mustache and cold gray eyes. A captain's bars gleamed on his shoulders. On his chest hung an array of medals, including the Indian Wars Campaign Medal. Those eyes swept the grove and landed on Nate with the impact of a physical blow. Recognition flared. "Well, well," the captain said, his voice carrying the authority of command, but underlaid with something darker. "Nathaniel Thornwood, I thought you were dead." Nate's hand tightened on his revolver, but he did not draw, not yet. "Captain Kane," he said flatly. Agnes looked between them, confusion and fear warring in her expression. Ezekiel Kane swung down from his horse with practiced ease. The 6 men behind him remained mounted, hands resting on their weapons. They had the look of hard men, the kind who followed orders without question and slept fine at night. "Step away from the prisoner, civilian," Kane said, all business now. "She's under military custody." Nate did not move. "Military custody?" he repeated. "For what crime?" Kane reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. He tossed it to Nate. It landed in the dirt between them. Nate picked it up, never taking his eyes off Kane for more than a second. He unfolded the paper one-handed, a skill learned in the Army when you could not afford to holster your weapon. It was a warrant for arrest. "Sister Agnes Moreau," Nate read aloud. "Treason against the United States. Aiding Confederate sympathizers. Theft of military supplies." His eyes scanned the document, and his jaw tightened. The seal was wrong. The format was outdated, and the signature at the bottom, allegedly from Colonel J. Harrington, was impossible. "Harrington retired in '82, Nate said, looking up at Kane. "This warrant is a forgery." The air in the grove seemed to crystallize. Kane's men shifted in their saddles. Tim, standing at the edge of the trees, looked ready to bolt or fight. Nate could not tell which. Agnes rose to her feet, unsteady but determined. "I've never stolen anything," she said, her voice stronger now. "I'm a nurse. I help the wounded. Union or Confederate, it makes no difference." Kane's smile was thin and cold. "Save your testimony for the court-martial, sister," he said. Then his eyes returned to Nate and the smile vanished entirely. "Thornwood, it's been a long time. 12 years? 13, Nate corrected. 13, Kane echoed. "Since you destroyed my career. Since you took my honor, my rank, my pension. Since you condemned me with your lies." "They weren't lies," Nate said quietly. "You massacred 12 women and children at the Lakota village near Bear Creek. Slaughtered them for the gold they had hidden." The men behind Kane exchanged glances. Kane's face darkened. "I was following orders. Putting down a hostile tribe. You were a quartermaster, Thornwood. You saw supply manifests and thought you understood war. You knew nothing." "I knew murder when I saw it," Nate said. "You testified against me," Kane continued, his voice rising. "Had me court-martialed, dishonorably discharged, stripped of everything I had earned." "You earned a noose," Nate said. "Be grateful you only got discharged." Kane's hand moved to his saber hilt, not drawing, just resting there. A threat made physical. "For 13 years I've thought about what I would do if I ever saw you again, Thornwood. The plans I made, the promises I whispered to myself in the dark." Nate said nothing, his heart beat steady and slow. He had been in this position before, facing men who wanted him dead. The key was not to flinch, not to show fear. Fear was blood in the water. But first, Kane said, visibly controlling himself, I need the sister. Hand her over. No. The word fell like a stone into still water. Kane's eyebrows rose. No, you're refusing a direct order from a United States Army captain? You're not a captain anymore, Nate said, and that warrant is fake, which means you're not here on official business, which means this is personal. Everything is personal in the end, Kane said softly. One of the riders behind Kane, a lean man with a scar running from his eye to his jaw, spoke up. His voice carried the twang of Missouri. Captain, we don't have time for this. Let me put a bullet in him and be done. Patience, Pike, Kane said, not looking back. Mr. Thornwood here has a boy with him. I saw the tracks. Where is he, Nate? Hiding in the trees. Nate's blood went cold. Kane smiled, seeing the reaction. That boy yours? None of your concern. Everything is my concern now, Kane said. You took my life, Thornwood. Fair trade would be me taking yours, but you already look dead. You've got that look men get when they've lost everything? Nate said nothing. Kane leaned forward slightly, studying him. What happened to you? After the trial, you disappeared. Rumor was you died in a fire, but here you are, alive and looking like a mountain savage. What broke you, Nate? The old wound in Nate's chest, the one that never healed, throbbed like a fresh injury. My family, he heard himself say. Fire took them. 10 years ago. Kane's expression flickered. For just an instant, something that might have been sympathy crossed his face. Then it hardened again. Then you understand loss, Kane said. Good, that will make this easier. He gestured to Pike. Take the sister. Kill Thornwood. Pike raised his Spencer carbine. Time slowed. Nate's hand blurred to his Colt, drawing and thumbing the hammer back in a single motion. But he knew he was too slow, knew the carbine was already aimed, knew this was where his story ended. Then a rock, fist-sized and thrown with surprising accuracy, struck Pike's hand. The carbine jerked upward, and the shot cracked through the grove, the bullet splintering bark 15 feet above Nate's head. Tim stood at the edge of the clearing, his arms still extended from the throw. Run, Nate, the boy screamed. Nate fired twice without aiming, forcing the riders back, then grabbed Agnes by the arm. Move! They ran. Behind them, Kane's voice roared orders. More shots rang out. Bullets smacked into trees, spraying splinters. A round buzz passed Nate's ear like an angry hornet. Tim led the way with the sure-footedness of youth, darting between pines. Nate pulled Agnes along, her nun's habit tangling in branches, slowing her down. He could hear horses crashing through the undergrowth behind them. They hit a game trail, and Nate veered left, up the slope toward the high country. The horses would struggle with the grade. It was their only chance. His lungs burned. His legs screamed. Beside him, Agnes stumbled and nearly fell. He caught her, practically dragging her now. I can't, she gasped. You can, he said. They scrambled up a scree field, loose stones sliding beneath their boots. Behind them, frustrated shouts. The horses had balked at the slope, just as Nate had hoped. But Kane's men would pursue on foot, and younger men with hate in their hearts could move fast. Nate reached a shelf of granite 20 yards wide, backed by a sheer cliff face. On one side, the drop back to the grove. On the other, a narrow cleft in the rock that Nate knew from years of wandering these mountains. In there, he told Tim, pointing to the cleft, go deep. Stay quiet. The boy hesitated. Go, Nate snapped. Tim vanished into the crack in the rock. Nate turned to Agnes. You too. She was bent over, hands on her knees, gasping for breath. Blood still trickled from the wound on her temple. Her blue eyes found his. Why are you helping me? She asked. You don't even know me. Nate looked at her, this stranger in nun's robes, this woman who had screamed like his wife screamed that night. The fire took everything. 10 years ago, he said quietly, I couldn't save the people that I loved. Maybe this is my second chance. The words surprised him as much as they surprised her. Before she could respond, he pushed her toward the cleft. Hide, I'll draw them off. They'll kill you. Maybe, Nate said, but they'll have to catch me first. He waited until she disappeared into the rock. Then he ran. Not down toward the grove where Kane's men would expect, but along the granite shelf toward the east, where the cliff face dropped away into a gorge. Behind him, boots scraped on stone. Voices called out, coordinating. Nate reached the edge of the cliff and looked down. 80 feet to a creek below, the water running fast and deep over rocks. Survivable if you hit it right. Probably. He heard footsteps behind him. Close now. He turned. 3 of Kane's men had followed him, spreading out in a semicircle. Pike was in the center, his scarred face twisted with rage. The other 2 were younger, harder to read. "End of the line, mountain man," Pike said. Nate's hand rested on his Colt, but he had 2 rounds left. 3 men. Bad odds. "You boys really want to die for Kane?" he asked. "We're getting paid," Pike said. "That's enough." "Paid to kill a nun?" Nate shook his head. "What happened to you to honor?" "Honor do not buy whiskey," Pike said, and raised his carbine. Nate drew and fired in one motion. His first shot took Pike in the thigh, spinning him around. The carbine clattered on stone. His second shot went wide as he dove aside, and then the other 2 men were firing, bullets sparking off granite where he had stood. Nate hit the ground and rolled, coming up on one knee, his Colt empty, his hand already moving to the Bowie knife at his belt. The 2 young riders advanced, reloading as they walked. Nate had maybe 5 seconds before they had fresh rounds chambered. He made a choice. He turned and jumped off the cliff. The world spun. Sky and stone and water kaleidoscoped around him. He kept his body straight, feet pointed down, arms tight to his sides, the way he had been taught jumping from railroad bridges as a boy. The water hit him like a fist. Cold drove the air from his lungs. Current grabbed him, tumbling him over rocks. His shoulder slammed into something hard. Pain exploded up his arm. Then his head broke the surface, and he gasped, sucking in air and spray. The creek had him, pulling him downstream, away from Kane's men, away from the grove, away from Agnes and Tim hiding in the stone. He let it take him. A half-mile later, the creek widened and slowed. Nate dragged himself onto a gravel bar, coughing water, his whole body shaking from cold and adrenaline. He lay there for a long moment, staring up at the sky that was starting to turn gold with evening. His mind raced. Kane was here. Kane, who had reason to hate him. Kane, with a forged warrant and armed men, and the freedom to do whatever he wanted in these lawless mountains. And Agnes, the nun with secrets in her eyes. What had she seen? What had she done that brought a disgraced cavalry officer hunting for her? Nate sat up, wincing at the pain in his shoulder. Not broken, but badly bruised. He needed to get back, needed to reach Tim and Agnes before Kane's men found the cleft in the rock. But as he looked back up the creek toward the grove, he saw smoke rising against the evening sky. They were burning the forest, trying to flush out their prey. Nate's hands clenched into fists. He thought of Sarah and the boys, their bodies blackened by fire. He thought of Tim, 12 years old and hidden in the rock. He thought of Agnes, who had asked him why he helped her. Second chances, he had said, maybe, or maybe he was just tired of running. Nate rose to his feet. Water streamed from his clothes. His rifle was gone, lost in the creek. His Colt was empty. His knife was all he had. It would have to be enough. He started walking back toward the smoke. Night was falling over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The temperature dropped fast at this altitude, plunging toward freezing. Nate moved through the darkness like a ghost, following game trails only he knew, circling back toward the grove. The smoke had spread. Kane's men had set 3 fires, creating a triangle of flame that was slowly closing in on the granite shelf where the cleft lay hidden. Clever and brutal. As Nate approached from downwind, he could hear voices. Kane's men had made camp at the edge of the grove, confident that their quarry was trapped. Nate counted 6 men around the fire. Pike was there, his leg bandaged, his face tight with pain. The other 5 looked relaxed, passing a bottle, laughing. Where was Kane? Nate's eyes swept the darkness beyond the firelight and found him. The captain stood alone near the largest ponderosa, staring up at the branch where Agnes had hung. His hand rested on his saber hilt. Even from a distance, Nate could see the tension in the man's shoulders. This was personal for Kane. Deeply personal. But why? A twig snapped behind Nate. He spun, knife coming up. Tim stood there, pale and wide-eyed in the moonlight. Nate grabbed the boy and pulled him into the shadows. his heart hammering. "What are you doing?" he hissed. "I told you to stay hidden." "Agnes sent me," Tim whispered. "She said we need to get to Redemption Creek. There's someone there who can help, a priest." "We're surrounded by fire and armed men," Nate said. "We're not getting anywhere tonight." "She says it's important," Tim insisted. "She says there's something the priest has, something that proves she's innocent." Nate looked at the boy's earnest face, then back at the fires eating through the forest. "Where is she now?" "Still in the cleft, waiting." Nate thought hard. Redemption Creek was 15 miles northeast through rough country, but if they could reach it, if there really was proof of Agnes's innocence, then maybe they had a chance. Maybe. "Can you lead us out?" Tim asked. "You know these mountains better than anyone." Nate looked at the boy, this child he had saved and who had saved him in return, and felt that crack in the ice around his heart widen a little more. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I can get us out." They moved through the darkness, keeping low, avoiding the firelight. Twice they had to freeze as one of Kane's men walked past, so close Nate could have reached out and touched him. But the riders were focused on the fires, on the trap they thought was closing. They reached the cleft just as the nearest fire line was 100 yards away, close enough that Nate could feel the heat. Agnes waited inside, her face smudged with soot, her habit torn. When she saw Nate alive and whole, something in her expression shifted. Relief flooded her features. "You came back," she said. "Did you think I wouldn't?" She looked at him for a long moment. "Most men would have run." "I'm not most men," Nate said. He led them deeper into the cleft, which narrowed to a crawl space before opening into a small cave. Nate had discovered this place years ago, stashed supplies here for emergencies. His hands found the oilcloth bundle by memory. Inside was a second Colt revolver, this one fully loaded, and a box of ammunition. Also jerky, matches, and a small flask of whiskey. He strapped on the gun and offered the jerky to Tim and Agnes. They ate in silence, listening to the crackle of flames outside. "Tell me about Redemption Creek," Nate said finally. Agnes swallowed her mouthful of jerky before speaking. Her voice was steady now, strengthened by rest and food. "Father Matthias O'Brien runs the church there. He's a good man. 7 months ago, I came to him and told him everything, about my real name, about what I witnessed, about why I've been hiding." "Your real name isn't Agnes Moreau?" "No." She took a breath. "It's Elizabeth Rousseau. My father was Charles Rousseau, a federal judge in Boston. 8 years ago, he was presiding over a corruption trial. Railroad executives accused of bribery and fraud. They offered him $50,000 to acquit. Did he take it? No, he was an honest man. The most honest man I've ever known." Her voice cracked slightly. 3 days before the verdict, I was working late in his office at the courthouse. I heard gunshots, ran to his chambers and found him on the floor. 3 men in suits standing over his body. One of them turned and looked at me. "Kane," Nate said. "Son?" He was younger then. No mustache, but those eyes. I'll never forget those eyes. Agnes wrapped her arms around herself. He raised his pistol. I ran. Hid in the only place I thought they wouldn't look. A convent, changed my name. Took vows I never truly believed in. Became Sister Agnes Moreau. And you've been running ever since. Until Father Matthias convinced me to stop running. To testify. He was gathering evidence, building a case. He had connections in Denver. People who might listen. She looked at Nate. But someone must have found out. Someone tipped off Kane that I was still alive. What evidence does the priest have? Agnes reached into her habit and withdrew a small leather pouch. From it, she took a single spent bullet casing tarnished with age. I took it from the crime scene before I ran. It's a 44-40, unusual for that time in Boston. And if you look closely at the base, Nate took the casing and tilted it toward the moonlight filtering through the cave entrance. Stamped into the brass were initials, EC. Ezekiel Kane, Agnes said. He had his bullets custom marked. Arrogance. He thought he was untouchable. One bullet casing won't convict him, Nate said. No, but Father Matthias has something else. A ledger, given to him by my father-in-law. Nate's head snapped up. Your father-in-law? I never married, Agnes said quietly. That's a figure of speech. I mean, your father-in-law. The cave seemed to spin. What are you talking about? Nate asked, his voice hoarse. Agnes looked at him with infinite compassion. Judge Samuel Thornwood, your wife's father. Before he died 10 years ago, he gave Father Matthias a leather journal. 147 pages documenting a criminal organization that he had been investigating for years. Bribes, murders, land grabs. They called themselves the Syndicate. Nate's throat had gone dry. Samuel was investigating criminals? He was building a case, just like my father was. And just like my father, he was killed for it. Agnes paused. Nathaniel, the fire that killed your wife and children. It wasn't an accident. The words hit Nate like a physical blow. What? Page 89 of the ledger, I read it. An entry dated August 14th, 1877, just 3 days before the fire. Contract on Thornwood family. Eliminate all witnesses. Payment, 3,000 in gold. Nate could not breathe. The cave walls pressed in. 10 years. 10 years he had blamed himself for not being there, for going on that hunting trip, for failing to protect them. 10 years of guilt, and it had been murder all along. Sarah knew, Nate heard himself say. His voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. She told me her father was in danger, said he was receiving threats. I thought he was paranoid, getting old. I didn't believe her. You couldn't have known, Agnes said gently. I should have listened. The words came out as a roar that echoed through the cave. She begged me not to go on that trip, begged me to stay close. But I went anyway. I left them alone. I left them to die. Tim reached out and touched Nate's arm, but the older man barely felt it. Sarah's face swam before his eyes. Her smile, the way she hummed while she cooked, the sound of her laugh. Thomas, 8 years old, who wanted to be a blacksmith like his grandfather. Daniel, only 5, who was afraid of thunder and slept with a wooden horse Nate had carved for him. All gone, all murdered, and he had spent 10 years in these mountains running from guilt that was not even his to carry. Who? Nate asked, his voice cold now, empty of everything but the need to know. Who did the syndicate hire? Agnes hesitated. Tell me. Ezekiel Kane. The name hung in the air like poison. Of course it was Kane. The man Nate had destroyed had returned the favor, had taken everything Nate loved and burned it to ash. And Nate had never known. He stood abruptly, his head nearly hitting the cave ceiling. We leave at first light, he said. We go to Redemption Creek. We get that ledger. And then we end this. Nate, Agnes said carefully, the syndicate is bigger than Kane. The ledger lists 47 corrupt officials, judges, senators, railroad executives. If we expose them, then we expose them, Nate said flatly. All of them. He walked to the cave entrance and stared out at the fires burning across the mountainside. Behind him, Tim and Agnes exchanged worried glances. The boy had never heard Nate speak with such cold fury, had never seen the look in his eyes that was there now. It was the look of a man who had finally found a reason to live, and that reason was vengeance. Outside, the fires burned through the night. Inside, Nathaniel Thornwood sat with his back against cold stone, his rifle across his knees, staring into darkness. He thought about Sarah, about the promises he had made to her on their wedding day, to protect her, to cherish her, to build a life together. He had failed, but maybe, just maybe, he could still keep one promise, to make the people who hurt her pay, not for justice, not for the law, for her. As the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the cave entrance, Nate rose. His body ached from the cold and the beating he had taken. But his mind was clear for the first time in a decade. He checked his weapons, loaded, ready. Tim and Agnes stirred from their fitful sleep. Redemption Creek is 15 miles northeast, Nate said. Rough country. Kane's men will be hunting us every step of the way. Stay close. Stay quiet. Do exactly as I say. They nodded. Nate led them out of the cave into the dawn. The fires had burned themselves out during the night, leaving acres of blackened forest. Smoke still rose from smoldering stumps. The smell of charred wood hung heavy in the air. Kane's camp was breaking up. Nate watched from a distance as the men saddled horses, preparing to continue the hunt. But Nate had spent 10 years learning every trail, every canyon, every hidden path through these mountains. He knew ways they would never find. They moved like smoke through the burned landscape, following a deer trail that wound between scorched pines. The morning was cold and still, their breath misted in the air. Behind them, somewhere in the devastation, Ezekiel Kane was mounting his horse, gathering his men, preparing to pursue. But ahead, in Redemption Creek, lay the truth. And the truth Nathaniel Thornwood had finally learned was worth fighting for, even if it killed him. The journey to Redemption Creek took them through country that tested even Nate's endurance. They moved through burned forest where ash fell like black snow, coating their clothes and hair. The sun climbed behind a veil of smoke, turning the sky the color of old blood. Tim led the way when the terrain allowed, his young eyes sharp for obstacles. Agnes followed, her nun's habit torn and filthy now, transformed from sacred garment to survival gear. And Nate brought up the rear, constantly checking their back trail for signs of pursuit. They found them 2 hours after dawn. Nate spotted the dust first, rising from the valley below, where Kane's men rode hard along the lower trail. 7 riders, pushing their horses without mercy. They had chosen speed over stealth, gambling that they could run their quarry to ground through sheer determination. They were wrong. Nate knew a dozen ways through these mountains that horses could not follow. Narrow defiles where a man had to turn sideways to pass, scree fields that would break a horse's leg, box canyons with X's only a climber could find. He chose a route that would cost them time but buy them distance. Up through the high country, where snow already dusted the peaks and the air grew thin enough to make breathing hurt. Agnes struggled with the altitude. Her face went pale, her breath coming in shallow gasps. But she never complained, never asked to rest. She simply put one foot in front of the other, her eyes fixed on Tim's back, following with the stubborn determination of someone who had been running for 8 years and would not stop now. Nate found himself watching her, the way she moved, economical and precise, the way she scanned the terrain, always thinking ahead. This was no sheltered nun who had spent her life in cloistered safety. This was a survivor. "You fight well for a woman of God," he said during a brief rest stop beside a spring. Agnes looked up from where she knelt, splashing cold water on her face. "My father believed women should know how to defend themselves. He taught me to shoot when I was 12, boxing when I was 14. A ghost of a smile crossed her lips. Shocked the other judges' wives at social gatherings when I expressed opinions about self-defense. Your father sounds like he was a good man. He was the best man I ever knew." Her smile faded. "Until Kane killed him." Nate filled his canteen, his mind working. "The ledger Father Matthias has, does it say who hired Kane for your father's murder?" "The same people who hired him for yours, the syndicate." Agnes stood, wiping her hands on her ruined habit. "They're not just criminals, Nathaniel. They're the people who built the railroads, who settle land disputes, who decide which towns get water rights and which ones die of thirst. They own the law in half the Western territories. Then we break them. With one ledger, they'll have it dismissed. Claim it's forged by the judge." "Maybe," Nate said. "But at least people will know. At least the truth will be told." Agnes studied his face. "You're not doing this for justice, are you? You're doing it for revenge." Nate met her eyes. "Does it matter?" "Yes, revenge is a fire that burns the person carrying it. Justice is something bigger, something that outlasts us." "I've been carrying fire for 10 years, Nate said quietly. "What's a little more?" Before Agnes could respond, Tim appeared from where he had been scouting ahead. "Town," the boy said. 2 miles. I can see the church steeple." Redemption Creek lay in a narrow valley where 2 streams converged. It was a small settlement, maybe 60 souls, built around a crossroads that led to Denver in one direction and Santa Fe in the other. The church stood at the north end, white clapboard with a bell tower that rose like a finger pointing at heaven. They approached from the east, using a gully for cover, until they were within 100 yards of the first buildings. Nate's eyes swept the town. No sign of Kane's men, but that meant nothing. They could be waiting. This could be a trap. "We need to get to Father Matthias," Agnes said. "The church is our best chance." It's also the most obvious place Kane will look, Nate pointed out. Then we'd better be quick. They moved through Redemption Creek like ghosts, keeping to the shadows, avoiding the main street. It was midday now, and the town had the sleepy quality of a place where not much happened, and people liked it that way. A blacksmith's hammer rang from an open forge. The smell of fresh bread drifted from a bakery. Two old men sat on a bench outside the general store, playing checkers and arguing about nothing. Normal life. The kind of life Nate had once known and lost. They reached the church without incident. The door stood open, an invitation to any who sought sanctuary. Nate went in first, his hand on his Colt, his eyes adjusting to the dim interior. The church was simple. It was wooden pews, a plain altar, windows of clear glass rather than stained. At the far end, kneeling before the altar, was an old man in priest's robes. He turned at the sound of their footsteps. Father Matthias O'Brien was perhaps 68, with a face like weathered stone and eyes that held the kind of wisdom that came from hearing too many confessions. He saw Agnes, and his expression transformed from curiosity to joy to concern in the space of a heartbeat. "Sister Agnes," he said, rising stiffly, "thank the Lord. When I heard about the soldiers asking after you, I feared the worst." "They're not soldiers," Agnes said. "They're murderers wearing uniforms." The priest's eyes shifted to Nate, taking in the wild beard, the weapons, the hard look of a man who had lived outside civilization for too long. "And this is?" "Nathaniel Thornwood," Agnes said. "He saved my life." Recognition flickered in the old priest's eyes. "Thornwood, Samuel's son-in-law. I prayed for you when I heard about the fire. Prayed for your family's souls." "Your prayers came 10 years too late," Nate said, more harshly than he intended. Father Matthias did not flinch. "Prayer is never too late. It continues beyond death, into eternity." He gestured to the pews. "Sit. You look exhausted." "We don't have time," Nate said. "Those men will be here soon. We need the ledger, the one Judge Thornwood gave you." The priest's face grew grave. "So Agnes told you." "She told me my family was murdered, that it's all documented in that book. I need to see it." Father Matthias studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Come with me." He led them through a door behind the altar into a small office that smelled of old paper and candle wax. Books lined the walls. A simple desk held a Bible and a rosary. The priest went to a painting of the Virgin Mary hanging on the far wall and lifted it down, revealing a safe set into the stone. His fingers worked a combination with practiced ease. The safe opened. Inside was a leather journal, thick and worn, the cover embossed with the seal of the federal judiciary. Father Matthias lifted it out with the reverence usually reserved for sacred texts. "Judge Thornwood gave this to me 3 weeks before he died," the priest said quietly. "Made me promise to keep it safe, to use it only if the time was right." He looked at Nate. "I believe that time has come." Nate took the ledger. The leather was soft from age and handling. He opened it to a random page and saw his father-in-law's precise handwriting, entries dated and cross-referenced, a lawyer's meticulous documentation of conspiracy and murder. His hands began to shake. "Page 89, Agnes said softly. Nate flipped through the pages, each one a catalog of corruption. Judges bought, witnesses silenced, land stolen through forged deeds and intimidation. Then he found it. August 14th, 1877. Contract on Thornwood family. Wife, Sarah, age 32. Sons, Thomas, 8, and Daniel, 5. Eliminate all witnesses to prevent testimony. Payment, $3,000 gold. Contractor, E. Kane, former lieutenant, 7th Cavalry. The words blurred. Nate's vision tunneled. Somewhere far away he heard Agnes calling his name, felt her hand on his arm. But all he could see was that entry, those cold, businesslike words describing the murder of everyone he had ever loved. Sarah, who had laughed at his bad jokes and cried when she was happy. Thomas, who had wanted to learn blacksmithing and who was afraid of Duzaz. Daniel, who had never met a stranger and who sang off-key whenever he was content. $3,000, that was the price of their lives. Nate, Agnes's voice cut through the red haze. Breathe, you need to breathe. He realized he had been holding his breath, his chest tight, his heart hammering against his ribs. He inhaled slowly, fighting for control. Tim stood nearby, his young face pale with understanding. The boy knew loss, knew what it meant to have everything taken away. He did not speak, but his presence was a steadying anchor. Who else? Nate asked, his voice hoarse. Who else did they kill? Father Matthias turned pages, reading aloud. 17 documented murders between 1875 and 1887. Federal prosecutors, witnesses, a newspaper editor who was getting too close to the truth, a surveyor who refused to falsify land reports. He paused. All of them connected to railroad expansion, mining rights, or territorial governance. The syndicate removes anyone who threatens their profits. And Cain is their executioner, Agnes added. One of them, the priest corrected. The ledger lists 3 other contract killers in their employ, but Cain is the most prolific. 14 kills attributed directly to him. Nate's jaw clenched. How do we stop them? We take this to the U.S. Marshal Service in Denver, Father Matthias said. Let federal law handle it. Federal law is corrupt, Nate said flatly. Half the names in this book are judges and marshals. Who do we trust? The priest had no answer. Agnes spoke up. There's one man, Deputy Marshal John Whitmore, stationed in Denver. My father trusted him, said he was one of the few honest lawmen left in the territory. And if he's been bought since then? Then we die trying, Agnes said simply. But at least we try. Before Nate could respond, the church door slammed open. Sheriff Benjamin Wade stood in the doorway, his hand on his sidearm, his weathered face tight with suspicion. Father, Wade said, his eyes never leaving Nate, I'm going to need you to step away from those people. Wade was 55, a veteran of too many frontier conflicts, with gray hair and a scar running across his jaw from a Comanche arrow 20 years past. He wore his badge like he meant it, and his eyes held the hard certainty of a man who had learned not to trust strangers. Sheriff, Father Matthias said calmly, not moving, these people are under the church's protection. I have a captain of the U.S. Cavalry outside saying they're fugitives, that the woman is wanted for treason and the man for assaulting a federal officer. Captain Cain is lying, Agnes said. Wade's eyes flicked to her. You deny striking a soldier? I deny the charge of treason, and the soldiers you're talking about are criminals wearing stolen uniforms. Wade's expression did not change. That's a serious accusation, ma'am. It's the truth. Can you prove it? Nate held up the ledger. Every word of it is in here. Names, dates, payments. Cain has killed 17 people for an organization called the Syndicate. He killed my family 10 years ago. Wade's eyes narrowed. You're Nathaniel Thornwood. You know me? Know of you. Served with you at Fort Laramie in '74. I was a corporal then. You probably don't remember. Nate studied the sheriff's face, searching his memory. A younger man, fewer scars, but the eyes were the same. Wade, you were in Quartermaster Corps. That's right. Wade stepped fully into the church now, closing the door behind him. I also remember the court-martial of Lieutenant Ezekiel Cain. You testified against him. Ended his career. He murdered women and children, Nate said. 12 of them. Lakota Sioux, unarmed, trying to surrender. He cut them down for the gold they were carrying. Wade nodded slowly. I heard the testimony. Believed it then. Believe it now. He paused. But that was 13 years ago. Now Cain's back, wearing captain's bars, with 6 armed men and a federal warrant. The warrant is forged, Agnes said. So you keep saying, but without proof. Hey, I have proof. Nate thrust the ledger toward Wade. Read it. The sheriff took the journal carefully, as if handling something dangerous. He opened it to a random page and began to read. The church fell silent except for the whisper of turning pages. Father Matthias prayed quietly, his lips moving over familiar Latin phrases. Tim sat on a pew, his hand resting on the knife at his belt, ready for violence he did not understand. Agnes watched Wade's face, hope and fear warring in her expression. And Nate stood perfectly still, every sense alert, waiting for the sheriff to make a choice that would decide all their fates. Finally, Wade closed the ledger. He looked at Nate. This is Judge Thornwood's handwriting. I recognize it from land deeds he witnessed. Can you trust it? Nate asked. Wade was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Samuel Thornwood, was the most honest man I ever met. If he wrote this, it's true. He handed the ledger back. But that doesn't change the situation. Kane has 7 men. I have 2 deputies, both of them boys who have never fired a shot in anger. If it comes to a fight, we lose. Then we don't fight, Father Matthias said. We send someone into Denver, get help from the Marshal Service. 4-day ride, Wade said. Kane won't wait that long. He'll tear this town apart looking for them. Let him come, Nate said quietly. Everyone turned to look at him. What? Wade asked. We stop running. We make a stand, right here. Agnes shook her head. That's suicide. You said it yourself. 7 against 3. 7 against 60, Nate corrected. This town has 60 people. Men who can shoot, women who can reload, children who can carry ammunition. He looked at Wade. Will your people fight? The sheriff's face was troubled. These are farmers and shopkeepers. Thornwood, not soldiers. Neither was I when I started. Neither were you. We learned. Nate's voice hardened. The syndicate thinks they can do whatever they want. Kill whoever they want. Take whatever they want, because people are too scared to fight back. Maybe it's time we show them different. Wade studied him. You're talking about turning this into a war. It's already a war, Nate said. We just haven't been fighting back. The door crashed open again. This time it was Mary Sullivan, the widow who ran the boarding house, her face flushed with urgency. Sheriff, riders coming in from the south, 7 of them, military uniforms. They're asking for the fugitives. Wade cursed softly. He looked at Nate. You've got about 2 minutes to hide or I have to arrest you. Don't hide. The voice came from the back of the church. An old man shuffled forward from where he had been sitting quietly in the last pew. Tobias Greenwood, 71 years old, the town blacksmith for 56 of those years. His hands were gnarled from decades of working metal, his back bent from age, but his eyes were sharp as broken glass. Don't hide, Tobias repeated. Don't run. Stand and fight. I've lived in territory since before it was a territory. Seen the syndicate take land from honest people. Seen good men hanged on false charges. Seen justice sold to the highest bidder. He pointed a crooked finger at Wade. You want to know if the people will fight? Ask them. You might be surprised. Wade looked like he wanted to argue, but before he could speak, the church door opened and Ezekiel Kane walked in. He was alone, his hand resting on his saber hilt, his eyes scanning the interior with practiced efficiency. When he saw Nate, he smiled. Thornwood, we meet again. 6 of his men stood outside, rifles ready, blocking the street. Captain, Wade said, his voice carefully neutral. This is a house of gun. You need to state your business. Kane's eyes never left Nate. My business is arresting fugitives. That woman is wanted for treason. That man for assaulting federal soldiers. On whose authority? Kane produced the forged warrant and handed it to Wade. The sheriff examined it, taking his time. This says Colonel Harrington signed it. That's correct. Harrington retired in '82. Kane's smile thinned. Then perhaps the paperwork is outdated, but the charges stand. I'm taking them into custody. No, Wade said simply. The temperature in the church seemed to drop 10 degrees. Excuse me? Kane asked, his voice dangerous. I said no, this warrant is fraudulent. The charges are false, and you're not taking anyone anywhere. Kane's hand moved to his saber, drawing it an inch before letting it slide back. Sheriff, I'm trying to be reasonable here. Don't make this difficult. Difficult is my specialty, Wade said. For a long moment, the 2 men stared at each other, Kane calculating odds, Wade standing his ground. Then Kane laughed, the sound harsh and bitter. You're making a mistake, Sheriff. The syndicate has a long memory. They don't forget people who interfere with their business. The syndicate, Wade repeated. So you admit you're working for them? Kane's eyes widened slightly. He had made a mistake. Let the name slip in his anger. I work for the United States Army, he said, but the words rang hollow now. No, Nate said, stepping forward. You work for whoever pays you. You killed my wife and sons for $3,000. Killed Judge Rousseau for $5. How much are they paying you for Agnes? For that ledger? Kane's mask of civility cracked. Raw hatred showed through. Your family died because Samuel Thornwood couldn't mind his own business. Same reason you'll die. Same reason everyone in this pathetic little town will die if they try to protect you. Is that a threat against my town? Wade asked, his hand moving to his revolver. It's a promise. Well, Kane turned and walked out, his boots loud on the wooden floor. As soon as he was gone, Wade let out a long breath. Well, he said, that could have gone better. Or worse, Father Matthias offered. Through the church window, they watched Kane mount his horse and ride toward the edge of town, his men following. But they did not leave. Instead, they made camp just beyond rifle range, settling in for a siege. Tobias shuffled to the window and spat. They're not going anywhere. They'll wait us out or starve us out. He turned to Nate. You really think we can fight them? I think we don't have a choice, Nate said. Then we'd better prepare. What followed was 3 hours of frantic preparation. Wade called a town meeting in the church, and to everyone's surprise, more than 40 people showed up. Nate stood before them, this wild mountain man with his long beard and scarred face, and told them the truth. About the syndicate, about the murders, about the ledger that documented it all. When he finished, silence filled the church. Then Mary Sullivan stood up. I lost my husband 3 years ago, she said, her voice clear and strong. Cholera, the doctor said. But he'd been asking questions about why our water rights were revoked right before the railroad came through, asking the wrong people. She looked around at her neighbors. Maybe it wasn't cholera. Maybe someone wanted him quiet. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. An old prospector named Jackson spoke up. My claim got jumped 2 years back. Men with lawyers and guns said I never had legal title. Ran me off land I'd worked for 15 years. I always wondered who bought off the land office clerk. More voices joined in, story after story of small injustices, suspicious deaths, legal manipulations. The pattern was clear once you knew to look for it. The syndicate had been bleeding Redemption Creek for years, and people were tired of it. So we fight, Tobias said, and the crowd murmured agreement. Nate organized them with the efficiency of his military training. He divided the defenders into 3 groups. The first group, 8 men who could shoot straight, would man defensive positions along Main Street, using overturned wagons and sandbag barriers. The second group, 6 more men plus Tim, would be held in reserve at the church, ready to reinforce wherever the attack came. The third group, the women and older children, would prepare ammunition, tend the wounded, and keep watch for fire, Kane's favorite weapon. Tobias, despite his age, insisted on contributing. He fired up his forge and began casting bullets, the rhythm of his hammer ringing like a heartbeat through the town. Agnes set up a medical station in the church basement, tearing sheets into bandages, boiling water, laying out the few surgical instruments Father Matthias possessed. And Nate climbed to the church bell tower with his Sharps rifle, the highest point in town, where he could see everything. From his perch, he watched Kane's camp, watched the men move around their fire, watched Kane himself, standing apart from the others, staring at the town with the intensity of a man nursing a 13-year grudge. Night fell, the temperature dropped toward freezing. Frost formed on the bell tower's wooden railings. Nate's breath misted in the air. Below, the town waited in tense silence. At midnight, movement. A figure detached from Kane's camp, moving quickly across the open ground toward town. Nate raised his rifle, tracking the target, his finger on the trigger. Then he recognized the man. Luther Pike, the scarred gunfighter he had shot in the leg earlier. Pike limped badly, favoring his injured thigh, using a rifle as a makeshift crutch. He was alone, unarmed except for the rifle he leaned on. Nate watched him approach, suspicious of a trap. Pike reached the first defensive position and called out, "Don't shoot! I'm here to talk to Thornwood." Wade appeared from behind a wagon, his revolver drawn. "State your business, Pike." "I need to speak with Thornwood, alone." "Not happening." "Please." The desperation in Pike's voice was raw. "I have information about my son." That got Nate's attention. He descended from the bell tower and approached Pike cautiously, his Colt drawn. Up close, Pike looked worse than Nate had thought. His leg wound had festered, the bandage seeping. His face was gray with pain and fever. "Your son?" Nate asked. Pike nodded. Jacob, he's 14, lives with my sister in Denver. Or he did until 3 days ago when Kane's men took him. Took him where? Here to Kane's camp. He's got the boy tied up like an animal. Says if I don't follow orders, he'll kill Jacob. Pike's voice broke. I've done bad things, Thornwood. Killed men for money, robbed and worse, but I never hurt kids. And I won't let Kane hurt mine. Nate studied the man's face, looking for deception, saw only fear and fading hope. What do you want from me? Help me get Jacob out. In return, I'll tell you Kane's plan. Tell you everything. Wade spoke up. Could be a trap. Could be, Nate agreed, or it could be a father trying to save his son. He looked at Pike. If you're lying, I'll kill you myself. Fair enough. They brought Pike into the church and sat him down. Agnes examined his leg wound, her nose wrinkling at the infection she found. This needs to be cleaned and dressed properly, or you'll lose the leg, she said. Later, Pike said, first you need to know what Kane's planning. He told them everything. How Kane had sent word to Denver 3 days ago, requesting reinforcements from the syndicate. 20 men, heavily armed, with orders to burn Redemption Creek to the ground and kill everyone in it. When do they arrive? Wade asked. Tomorrow, maybe the day after. Depends on weather and how hard they push. Nate cursed. We can't hold against 27 men. Yes, then you attack first, Pike said. Tonight, while it's just Kane and 6 others. Catch them sleeping. 7 against 60, Tobias said from the doorway. I like those odds better. Agnes finished bandaging Pike's leg. And Jacob? Where is he in the camp? North side, tied to a wagon wheel. 2 guards, but they're usually drunk by this hour. Nate thought hard. An attack on the camp was risky, but waiting for reinforcements was suicide. We go tonight, he decided. 3 teams. Team 1 creates a diversion from the east. Team 2 hits from the west, takes out the guards. Team 3 gets Jacob and anyone else who might be held prisoner. And Kane? Wade asked. Nate's expression hardened. He's mine. They prepared in silence, checking weapons, saying prayers, making peace with whatever came next. Tim approached Nate as he was loading his rifle. I want to come with you, the boy said. No. You taught me to shoot, to track, to fight. Let me help. Nate knelt down so he was eye level with Tim. You help by staying here, protecting Agnes and the others if something goes wrong. Can you do that? Tim wanted to argue. Nate could see it in his eyes. But finally the boy nodded. Good man, Nate said softly. He stood and found Agnes watching him. You're going to try to kill him, she said. Not a question. Yes. Revenge won't bring them back. I know, but it might help me sleep at night. Agnes stepped closer. Nathaniel, I've spent 8 years running from what happened to my father. 8 years hiding behind vows I never truly believed in, telling myself I was serving God when really I was just serving my own fear. She placed her hand on his chest over his heart. Don't let revenge consume you the way fear consumed me. There's a difference between justice and murder. Is there? Nate asked. Because right now I can't see it. Then let me see it for both of us. She held his gaze. Come back alive. Not because you've avenged your family, but because you have a reason to keep living. What reason is that? She did not answer with words. Instead, she rose on her toes and kissed him. It was brief, chaste almost, but it held a promise that made something long dead stir in Nate's chest. When she pulled back, her eyes were wet. That's your reason, she said. Then she turned and walked away, leaving Nate standing alone in the church, his heart hammering against his ribs. At 2 a.m, they moved out. Nate led the Western team, himself, Wade, and Tobias, who had insisted on coming despite his age. The Eastern diversion team consisted of 5 men armed with rifles and instructions to make noise at precisely 3 a.m. And Pike, his leg freshly bandaged, would guide the rescue team to where Jacob was held. They approached Kane's camp in darkness, moving across open ground with agonizing slowness. The night was cold and clear, stars burning overhead like chips of ice. At 3 a.m., gunfire erupted from the east. Kane's men bolted awake, grabbing weapons, running toward the sound. Nate and his team hit from the west. Tobias, despite his 71 years, moved with surprising speed. He fired his shotgun into the camp. The blast like thunder, buckshot tearing through a tent where two men slept. Wade took down a guard with a single rifle shot. Nate ran toward the center of camp where he had seen Kane's command tent, his Colt in one hand, his Bowie knife in the other. A man stepped out of the darkness, raising a carbine. Nate shot him without breaking stride. Another came from the left. Nate ducked under a wild swing and drove his knife up under the man's ribs. Then he was at Kane's tent. He ripped open the flap and lunged inside. Empty. Kane had already fled. Nate cursed and spun, searching the chaos of the camp. Muzzle flashes, shouts, the smell of gunpowder and blood. There, Kane was running toward the horses, trying to escape. Nate pursued, his legs pumped, his lungs burned. The distance closed. Kane reached his horse and swung into the saddle. He kicked the animal hard, sending it leaping forward. Nate stopped, raised his Sharps rifle, and fired. The heavy .50 caliber round hit Kane's horse in the shoulder. The animal screamed and went down, throwing Kane hard into the dirt. Nate ran forward, working the lever to chamber another round. Kane rolled to his feet, his saber already drawn. They faced each other in the firelight of the burning camp, two men with 13 years of hatred between them. "You should have stayed in your mountain, Thornwood," Kane said, breathing hard. "You should have stayed dishonorably discharged," Nate replied. Kane lunged. Steel met steel as Nate barely got his knife up in time to parry the saber slash. The impact jarred his arm. Kane was strong, trained, a career soldier who knew how to kill. But Nate had survived a decade in the mountains where a single mistake meant death. He ducked under Kane's next swing and drove his shoulder into the older man's chest, sending them both crashing to the ground. They rolled, grappling, each trying to get a weapon into position. Kane's knee came up, catching Nate in the ribs. Pain exploded through his side. Nate headbutted Kane, feeling the man's nose break under his forehead. Blood sprayed. Kane howled and brought the pommel of his saber down on Nate's shoulder, numbing his arm. They separated, both climbing to their feet, circling. "You took everything from me," Kane shouted. "My career, my honor, everything." "You took my family," Nate roared back. "My wife, my children, for $3,000. They were in the way, just like you're in the way now." Kane attacked again, his saber a blur of steel. Nate gave ground, parrying desperately, knowing one mistake would end him. Then his foot caught on something. A body, and he went down hard. Kane loomed over him, raising his saber for the killing blow. And a gunshot rang out. Kane staggered, blood spreading across his shoulder. He turned. Tim stood 20 feet away, Nate's spare Colt gripped in both hands, smoke rising from the barrel. "The boy," Kane said in disbelief. "You brought a child to a gunfight." "I brought myself," Tim shouted and fired again. This shot went wide, but it gave Nate the second he needed. He swept Kane's legs out from under him, sending the man crashing down. Then Nate was on top of him, knee on chest, knife at throat. Kane's gray eyes stared up at him, and for the first time, Nate saw fear there. "Do it," Kane gasped. "Kill me. Prove you're just like me." Nate's hand trembled, the knife pressed against skin. One quick pull, and it would be over. Justice, revenge, whatever name you wanted to give it. He thought of Sarah, of Thomas, of Daniel, and he thought of Agnes, her lips on his, her words in his ear. There's a difference between justice and murder. "No," Nate said. He stood up, taking the knife away. Kane looked stunned. "What?" "You're not worth it," Nate said. "You're not worth becoming the kind of man who kills in cold blood." He turned to Tim. "Get rope. We're taking him back to face real justice." But as he turned his back, Kane moved. A hidden derringer in his boot. 2 shots, both aimed at Nate's back. "Nate!" Tim screamed. Luther Pike came out of nowhere, throwing himself between Nate and the gun. The first shot hit Pike in the chest. The second caught him in the stomach. Pike went down hard. Nate spun and kicked the derringer from Kane's hand. Then he drove his fist into the man's jaw, once, twice, 3 times, until Kane went limp. He dropped to his knees beside Pike. Blood soaked the ground. Too much blood. Pike's eyes were already glazing. "Jacob," Pike whispered. "Did they get Jacob?" Wade appeared, leading a boy by the hand. Jacob Pike, 14 years old. Terrified but alive. He's safe, Nate said. We got him out. Pike's face relaxed. He looked at his son. Jake, you listen to me. You don't, you don't follow in my footsteps. You be better than I was. Pa, Jacob sobbed. Don't die. Please don't die. I love you, boy. Always, always loved you. Then Luther Pike's eyes went distant, and he was gone. Nate closed the dead man's eyes gently. Around them, the camp was quiet. Kane's men were dead or fled. The fight was over, but the cost had been high. Tobias had taken a bullet in the side, though he insisted it was just a scratch. 2 men from the Eastern Diversion team were dead, and Pike, who had betrayed his employer to save his son, lay cooling in the dirt. They tied Kane's hands and dragged him back to Redemption Creek as dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that looked like blood and fire. The town gathered to watch them bring in the prisoner. Kane, once proud and arrogant, now beaten and humiliated, his nose broken, his shoulder bleeding, his eyes hollow with defeat. Agnes met them at the church, her eyes searching Nate's face. It's done, he said. She looked at Kane. The trial? Sheriff Wade will take him to Denver. Let federal law handle it. And the reinforcements? We'll be ready. But even as he said it, Nate wondered if they would be. 20 more men, professional killers. How many more would die? As if reading his thoughts, Father Matthias spoke up. I've already sent riders to the neighboring towns, told them what's happening, asked for help. He smiled grimly. The syndicate has made enemies everywhere. I think you'll find people willing to fight. And he was right. Over the next 24 hours, men and women came to Redemption Creek. Farmers who had lost land, miners whose claims had been stolen, families who had lost loved ones to suspicious accidents. By the time the syndicate's reinforcements arrived 2 days later, they found not a helpless town but an army. 60 defenders had become 120. The syndicate's men took one look at the defensive positions, the armed townspeople, the grim determination on every face, and they turned around. The war was not over, but this battle had been won. That night, as the town celebrated, Nate stood on the church steps, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Agnes found him there. What are you thinking, son? She asked. That maybe I've been dead long enough, he said. She took his hand. Then it's time to start living again. He looked at her, this woman who had been running just as he had, both of them fleeing ghosts until they found each other. Yes, he said, I think it is. And for the first time in 10 years, Nathaniel Thornwood smiled. The old man's voice cracked as he read aloud from the journal, the words written 40 years ago in a hand steadier than his own was now. His great-grandchildren sat in a semicircle around his chair, their young faces rapt with attention as the afternoon sun slanted through the windows of his workshop. 2 days after the battle, Nathaniel Thornwood read, his 83-year-old fingers tracing the faded ink, Sheriff Wade took Ezekiel Kane to Denver in chains. Father Matthias rode with him, carrying the ledger that would bring down the syndicate. And I stood in the ruins of Redemption Creek, surrounded by the living and the dead, wondering if vengeance had given me peace or simply traded one kind of emptiness for another. Young Thomas, 16 years old and named for the uncle he would never meet, leaned forward. Did it, grandfather? Did killing Kane's men give you peace? The old man closed the journal and looked at his great-grandson with eyes that had seen too much violence and just enough grace. That, he said softly, is what the rest of the story is about. He opened the journal again, turning to the final pages, and his voice grew stronger as memory carried him back across the decades to that autumn when everything changed. The day after Sheriff Wade departed for Denver, Nate woke to find Redemption Creek transformed. What had been a sleepy frontier settlement now looked like a military encampment. Men stood watch on rooftops. Women fortified windows with sandbags. Children as young as 8 ran messages between defensive positions. They were waiting for the next attack. Everyone knew it would come. The syndicate did not forgive, did not forget, and they had resources that dwarfed anything a small town could muster. Nate walked the perimeter at dawn, checking defenses, his breath misting in the cold mountain air. The town had buried its dead the previous evening, 8 graves dug in the cemetery behind the church. Luther Pike lay among them, his final betrayal of Kane redeemed by his sacrifice. Jacob Pike sat on his father's grave as Nate passed, the boy's shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Nate paused, unsure what to say. What did you tell a 14-year-old whose father had been both criminal and hero? He saved my life, Nate finally said. At the end, he chose you over everything else. That counts for something. Jacob looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. Will it count for anything when people remember him? Or will they just remember he was a killer? They'll remember what you do with the life he gave you, Nate said. Make him proud, son. The boy nodded and turned back to the grave. Nate continued his rounds. He found Agnes in the church, tending to Tobias Greenwood. The old blacksmith had indeed been shot during the raid on Kane's camp, and despite his insistence that it was nothing, infection had set in. He lay on a cot near the altar, his weathered face gray with fever. How is he? Nate asked quietly. Agnes looked up from where she was changing bandages. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. She had barely slept since the battle. The bullet went clean through, which is fortunate, but at his age, with this much trauma. She did not finish the sentence. Did not need to. Tobias's eyes fluttered open. Still here, sister. Takes more than one bullet to kill a Greenwood. His voice was weak but determined. My grandfather survived Shiloh with worse. Your grandfather was 60 years younger, Agnes said gently. Details. Tobias managed a grin that became a grimace of pain. Thornwood, come here. Nate approached the cot. The old man reached out with a gnarled hand and gripped Nate's wrist with surprising strength. I've been smithing for 56 years, Tobias said. Made tools, horseshoes, wagon wheels. Made weapons too when the army needed them. But I never made anything that mattered as much as what I'm about to give you. Save your strength, Nate said. To hell with that. Listen. Tobias's eyes blazed with the intensity of a man who knew his time was short. In my forge, behind the anvil, there's a loose brick. Pull it out. Inside you'll find a box, so bring it to me. Nate wanted to argue but recognized the set of the old man's jaw. He had seen that look before, in soldiers who knew they were dying and had final orders to give. He went to the forge. The building still smelled of coal smoke and hot metal. Nate found the loose brick exactly where Tobias had said. Behind it, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small wooden box. He brought it back to the church. Tobias took the box with trembling hands and opened it. Inside, nestled in red velvet, was a revolver unlike any Nate had ever seen. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Every surface engraved with intricate patterns, the grip inlaid with silver, the barrel perfectly balanced. Made it 30 years ago, Tobias said, his voice fading. For my son. He was killed before I could give it to him. Comanche raid in '61. He pressed the gun into Nate's hands. It's yours now. Use it to protect what matters. You need to build something better than what we had. Tobias, and one more thing. The old man's grip tightened. That boy, Tim, he looks at you like you hung the moon. Don't waste that. Don't let him grow up thinking violence is all there is. Teach him to build, not just destroy. I will, Nate promised. Tobias smiled. Good man. His eyes closed. Now let an old fool rest. Agnes checked his pulse and nodded to Nate. He's sleeping. The fever should break tonight, or she did not finish. They stepped outside into the cool morning air. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Agnes said, He reminds you of your father, doesn't he? How did you know? The way you look at him, like you're seeing someone else. Nate nodded slowly. My father was a blacksmith too. Tobias learned the trade from him back in Ohio before they came west. My father died when I was 14. Taught me everything he knew about working metal, about patience, about creating instead of destroying. He looked at the revolver in his hands. I forgot those lessons somewhere along the way. Maybe it's time to remember them, Agnes said softly. Before Nate could respond, Tim came running across the square, his young face flushed with urgency. Nate! Riders approaching from the north! Lots of them! Nate's hand went to his gun, the reinforcements. They had come faster than expected. He ran to the northern barricade, Agnes close behind. But when he looked through his spyglass at the approaching column, confusion replaced his battle readiness. These were not syndicate men. The lead rider carried a U.S. Marshal's badge that caught the morning sun. Behind him rode perhaps 30 men, all armed, all wearing the look of lawmen who had ridden hard and slept little. Nate lowered the spyglass. "Stand down! They're federal marshals!" The column entered Redemption Creek at a walk, horses lathered and exhausted. The lead marshal, a lean man with iron gray hair and a scar across his cheek, dismounted and approached Nate. "I'm looking for Nathaniel Thornwood," he said. "You found him." The marshal's eyes assessed Nate with the practiced gaze of someone who had spent a lifetime judging character. "Deputy Marshal John Whitmore," he introduced himself. "Out of Denver. Sheriff Wade reached us 3 days ago with quite a story, and a ledger that's already caused 3 judges to resign and 2 senators to flee the territory." Nate felt something release in his chest. "You believe it? The ledger?" "Believe it? Son, we've been investigating the syndicate for 2 years. That ledger is the smoking gun we needed. Judge Thornwood documented everything we suspected but couldn't prove." Whitmore looked around at the fortified town. "Wade said you were expecting trouble. Syndicate reinforcements. 20 men, according to Luther Pike before he died. They won't be coming." Nate turned sharply. "What?" Whitmore allowed himself a tight smile. "We intercepted them 50 miles north. When they learned we had federal warrants for all of them, most surrendered. A few ran. We'll hunt them down." It took a moment for the words to sink in. It was over. The fight they had been bracing for, the battle that would have cost dozens more lives, was not coming. "What about Kane?" Nate asked. "In a cell in Denver, awaiting trial. He'll hang Thornwood, along with 17 other men we've arrested in the last 72 hours. The syndicate is finished." Agnes had been listening from a few feet away. Now she stepped forward. "All of them?" she asked. "Everyone in the ledger?" "Every name we can find. Some have fled. Some are already dead by their own hand rather than face justice. But the organization is broken. It'll take years to root out all the corruption, but the back is broken." Agnes pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. 8 years of running, 8 years of fear, and it was finally over. Nate reached out and pulled her close. She buried her face in his chest and wept, her body shaking with relief and exhaustion and grief for all the years lost to fear. Whitmore politely looked away, giving them a moment. When Agnes had composed herself, the marshal continued. "There's the matter of your testimony, Miss Rousseau. Or should I say Miss Moreau? The federal prosecutor will need your statement about what you witnessed in your father's murder." "I'll testify," Agnes said, her voice steady now. "To everything." "Good. We'll need Thornwood's testimony, too, about the attack here, about Kane's confession regarding his family." Whitmore paused. "I'm sorry for your loss, by the way. Judge Thornwood was a good man. So was his daughter and grandsons, from what I heard." Nate nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The marshal looked between them. "You two should come to Denver. Give your statements. Then," he shrugged, "then you can decide what comes next." What came next turned out to be 6 weeks in Denver while prosecutors built their case. Nate and Agnes testified before a grand jury. The ledger was authenticated by handwriting experts. 37 indictments were issued. And slowly, painfully, the truth came out. The syndicate had been operating since 1870, born from the chaos of post-Civil War Reconstruction. Railroad barons and mining magnates had realized that controlling judges and marshals was more profitable than competing fairly. They had built an empire on corruption, theft, and murder. Judge Samuel Thornwood had been investigating them for 5 years before they killed him. His final act had been to document everything he had learned, knowing it would cost his life, but hoping it might save others. It had. 17 men went to the gallows for murder. 43 others received prison sentences ranging from 5 years to life. And on a cold morning in November 1887, Ezekiel Kane stood on the scaffold in Denver with a noose around his neck. Nate had been invited to witness the execution. He declined. He had already seen too much death. Instead, he spent that morning in a small office at the federal courthouse, signing documents that would change his life forever. Agnes sat beside him, her hand in his, as a judge who was actually honest performed a civil ceremony. When it was over, Nathaniel Thornwood and Elizabeth Rousseau were husband and wife. They had decided to keep her religious name in honor of the woman she had been during those years of hiding. Sister Agnes was dead, but Agnes Thornwood was born, carrying the strength of both identities. Tim served as witness, standing tall in his first suit, looking proud and terrified in equal measure. After the ceremony, as they walked through Denver's streets, Agnes suddenly stopped. "I need to go back," she said. "Back where?" "To Santa Fe, to the convent. I never formally left, never requested dispensation from my vows. I just ran." She looked up at Nate. "I need to do this properly. Close that chapter of my life the right way." So they traveled south to Santa Fe, arriving at the Carmelite convent on a bright December morning. The Mother Superior, an ancient woman with eyes like flint, received them in a sparse office that smelled of beeswax and old wood. "Sister Agnes," she said, her voice revealing nothing. "Or should I say Elisabeth Rousseau? We heard about your activities." Agnes stood straight, her chin up. "I took vows under false pretenses, Mother. I was hiding, not serving God. And I have found my true calling elsewhere." As a wife, the Mother Superior's tone held disapproval. "And a woman who chooses to live rather than hide, to fight for justice rather than pray for it from a safe distance." Agnes held up her left hand, showing her wedding ring. "I request formal dispensation from my vows." The Mother Superior was silent for a long moment. Then unexpectedly, she smiled. "Do you know why I accepted you 8 years ago, child? When you came to us with obviously false papers and a story full of holes?" Agnes shook her head. "Because I saw in your eyes what I once saw in a mirror. Fear, desperation, the look of someone running from demons." The old woman leaned forward. "I was not always a nun, you see. I too fled to the church. But unlike you, I stayed because I was too frightened to leave. I built a prison of piety and called it devotion." She stood and walked to a cabinet, withdrawing a document. "Your dispensation was signed the day after you left. I knew you would not return. I knew you had found your true path." She handed the paper to Agnes. "Go with God, child. But more importantly, go with courage. Live the life I was too afraid to live." Agnes took the document with trembling hands. Then she embraced the old woman, both of them crying. When they left the convent, Agnes looked different, lighter, as if chains she had been carrying for 8 years had finally fallen away. "Where now?" Nate asked. Agnes smiled. "Home, to Redemption Creek. We have work to do." They returned to find the town transformed again, this time by hope rather than fear. Word of the syndicate's collapse had spread. People who had lost land were reclaiming it. Disputed water rights were being resolved fairly. The corruption that had poisoned the territory for 17 years was being cleansed. But the cost had been high. Tobias Greenwood had died while they were in Denver, his old body finally surrendering to the infection. He was buried next to the other defenders, his grave marked with a simple cross forged from his own iron. Nate stood before the grave on their first day back, holding the revolver the old man had given him. "I'll teach Tim," he said quietly to the mound of earth. "Teach him to build, to create, to be more than just a man who knows how to kill." Agnes came to stand beside him. "We should start a school, a real one, not just the informal lessons Father Matthias provides. Teach children reading, writing, mathematics. Give them choices beyond farming and mining." "You want to be a teacher?" "I want to be useful. The way my father taught me to be useful. The way your wife was useful in her community." She looked at him. "Sarah would have wanted that, wouldn't she? For you to build something lasting?" Nate thought of Sarah's laugh, her kindness, her fierce determination to make their corner of the world better. "Yes," he said, "she would have wanted that." So they built. With money from Nate's trapping and Agnes's share of her father's estate, they constructed a schoolhouse on the edge of Redemption Creek. One room to start, but with plans for expansion. Desks built by Nate in Tobias's forge, using the skills his father had taught him 40 years ago. Agnes taught reading and arithmetic. Nate taught practical skills, woodworking, basic blacksmithing, how to read maps and navigate by stars. Tim, now 13, helped with the younger children, patient and kind in ways that reminded Nate of Thomas. Months passed, the school grew. More families moved to Redemption Creek, drawn by its reputation as a place where justice had triumphed over corruption. Father Matthias returned from Denver with news that the last of the syndicate's leaders had been sentenced. The organization was truly broken, its network of corruption dismantled. Sheriff Wade retired 5 years later, his job done. Jacob Pike, Luther's son, joined the Marshal Service at 18 and eventually returned to Redemption Creek as sheriff at 23, in acknowledgement of his father's final sacrifice and his own dedication to justice. And slowly, painfully, Nate began to heal. The nightmares of fire did not stop. Perhaps they never would, but they grew less frequent. And when he woke screaming in the night, Agnes was there, her arms around him, her voice soft in the darkness, reminding him that he was alive, that he had people who needed him, that vengeance had not consumed him after all. One evening in spring, as Nate was closing up the schoolhouse, he found a letter waiting on his desk. The return address was Denver, U.S. Marshal Service. Inside was a brief note from Deputy Marshal Whitmore. Thornwood, thought you should know, Kane's execution went forward as scheduled. He confessed everything before the end, trying to bargain for his life. Didn't work, but his testimony helped us identify 3 more syndicate members we had missed. Justice is slow, but she's thorough. Your family is avenged. The question is, what will you do with the rest of your life, Whitmore? Nate read the letter 3 times. Then he walked outside to where Agnes was playing with a group of children, teaching them a singing game she had learned in Boston a lifetime ago. He watched her laugh, watched her pick up a little girl who had fallen and scraped her knee, watched her wipe away tears and kiss the injury better. And he realized something fundamental. Vengeance had not saved him. This had, building instead of destroying, teaching instead of killing, loving instead of mourning. He folded the letter and put it in his pocket. That night, after Tim had gone to bed in his room above the schoolhouse, Nate and Agnes sat on their porch watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Whitmore wrote, Nate said, Kane is dead. The syndicate is finished. It's really over. Agnes took his hand. How do you feel? Nate thought about it. Empty. I spent 10 years consumed by guilt. Spent the last few months consumed by the need for justice. And now that it's done, he shook his head. I don't know what I feel. Then maybe it's time to figure out what you want to feel, Agnes said. What you want to build instead of what you want to destroy. I want, Nate paused, searching for words. I want what we have here, the school, the town, Tim, you. I want to wake up and not think about death. I want to sleep without dreaming of fire. That will come, Agnes said. Give it time. And I want, he turned to her, I want to try again, to be a father, a real one this time, not just someone teaching survival skills. Agnes's eyes widened. Are you saying, I'm saying I spent 10 years dead, and you brought me back to life, and maybe it's time to create life instead of mourning it. Agnes kissed him then, long and deep, and when she pulled back, her eyes were wet. I was hoping you'd say that, she whispered. 9 months later, in the winter of 1888, Elizabeth Agnes Thornwood gave birth to a daughter. They named her Sarah, after the woman Nate had loved first. And if there were tears when he held his newborn daughter, they were tears of joy mixed with sorrow, grief transformed into hope. Tim, now 14, held his new sister with the careful reverence of someone who understood how precious and fragile life was. I'll protect her, he promised, the way you protected me. I know you will, Nate said. And as he looked at his growing family, at the town they were building, at the school where children learned to read and dream and hope, Nathaniel Thornwood finally understood something his father had tried to teach him 40 years ago. Vengeance was a fire that consumed everything it touched, but justice was a foundation you could build upon. The years that followed were not perfect. There were setbacks, droughts, and hard winters, the occasional drifter causing trouble. But Redemption Creek endured. The school expanded. Agnes became known throughout the territory as an educator who believed girls deserved the same education as boys, a radical notion that attracted families from hundreds of miles away. Nate ran the forge, creating tools and teaching the craft to any who wanted to learn. The revolver Tobias had given him hung on the wall of their home, loaded but never fired, a reminder of what they had survived. Tim grew into a fine young man, eventually taking over as the town's blacksmith when Nate's hands grew too arthritic for the heavy work. He married at 22 to a schoolteacher named Margaret who had come west from Philadelphia. They had 4 children, all of whom called Nate and Agnes Grandma and Grandpa without any confusion about blood relations. Jacob Pike served as sheriff for 36 years, honest and fair, his father's reputation redeemed by the son's dedication to justice. And Sarah Thornwood, named for a grandmother she would never meet, grew up to become a doctor, one of the first female physicians in Colorado, carrying forward both her mother's legacies of service and courage. Now, 40 years after the battle that broke the syndicate, Nathaniel Thornwood sat in his workshop reading from the journal he had kept all those years. His great-grandchildren sat at his feet, their young faces reflecting the firelight as the afternoon faded toward evening. "So you see," he said, closing the book, "the question young Thomas asked me earlier was the right one. Did killing Cain's men give me peace? And the answer is no. Violence never gives peace. It only creates emptiness that must be filled with something else." "What did you fill it with, grandfather?" Thomas asked. Nate smiled. "With all of you. With the school your great-grandmother built. With the town we saved. With the choice to create instead of destroy." He looked at each of their young faces in turn. "You'll face injustice in your lives. You see people hurt and systems corrupt, and you'll have to choose what kind of person you want to be. My father taught me to build. The army taught me to kill. It took me until I was 43 to remember which lesson mattered more." He stood slowly, his 83-year-old joints protesting. "The world needs builders. It has plenty of destroyers. Be builders. Create something that outlasts you. That's the only vengeance worth taking against the darkness in this world. You don't fight it with more darkness. You fight it with light." Young Thomas picked up the journal. "Can I keep this, grandfather? Learn from it?" "That's why I wrote it," Nate said. "So someone would remember. So someone would know that even when you've lost everything, even when vengeance seems like the only path forward, there's another choice. A harder choice, maybe, but a better one." The door opened and Agnes entered. 88 years old now, her hair white as mountain snow, but her blue eyes still sharp. She had outlived most of her generation, a fierce woman who had spent 60 years teaching children to read and think and question. "Telling the story again?" she asked with a knowing smile. They needed to hear it. "We always need to hear it," she said. She looked at the children. "Your grandfather likes to think he saved me that day in Devil's Throat. But the truth is we saved each other. He taught me to stop running. I taught him to start living. That's what love is. Not romance, not passion. It's two broken people helping each other heal." She took Nate's hand in hers, their fingers intertwining with the ease of 4 decades together. "And now," she said, "you children should head home before your parents worry, and take this old man's advice. Choose the hard path. Choose to build. Choose to forgive. Choose to love even when hate seems easier." The children filed out, Thomas carrying the journal carefully as if it were made of glass. When they were gone, Nate and Agnes stood together in the workshop's fading light. "Do you think they understood?" Nate asked. "Some of it. They'll understand more as they get older. That's how wisdom works." Agnes leaned against him. "Any regrets?" Nate thought about it. Thought about Sarah and Thomas and Daniel, gone 40 years but never forgotten. Thought about the violence and the vengeance and the long road back to something like peace. "Only one," he said finally. "I wish I could tell Sarah that I finally learned her father's lesson. That justice isn't about punishment. It's about building a world where punishment isn't necessary." "I think she knows," Agnes said softly. They stood together as night fell over Redemption Creek, two old people who had survived fire and loss and vengeance to find something better on the other side. And far away in a cemetery behind a small white church, 8 graves stood in a neat row. Luther Pike, who had died saving the man he once tried to kill. Tobias Greenwood, who had given his final days protecting what mattered. 6 others whose names were carved in stone but whose sacrifice lived on in the town they had saved. Above them, stars emerged one by one, ancient and eternal, bearing witness to all that had been lost, and all that had been saved, and all that had been built from the ashes of vengeance. Justice in the end was not about the dead. It was about what the living chose to do with the time they had left. And that, Nathaniel Thornwood had learned after 40 years, was the only redemption that mattered. The one you created yourself. One day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of creation at a time, until the darkness you had carried for so long was finally transformed into light. But peace, like darkness, is never permanent. 3 months after Nate told his story to his great-grandchildren, a letter arrived at the Redemption Creek post office. No return address, posted from Denver. Agnes brought it to Nate in his workshop. The handwriting on the envelope was elegant, educated, not the rough script of frontier correspondence. Nate's hands shook as he opened it. Inside, a single sheet of expensive linen paper. The message was brief. Dear Mr. Thornwood, congratulations on your 40 years of peace. You broke my brother's organization, sent him to the gallows, destroyed everything he built. I have spent those same 40 years in Europe, rebuilding, learning patience, waiting. Now I am home. Your school is lovely. Your great-grandchildren are beautiful. That forge Timothy runs produces excellent work. It would be tragic if anything happened to them. We will meet soon. Regards, the architect's brother. Nate read the letter 3 times, then he looked up at Agnes. She saw his face and understood immediately. It's not over, she said quietly. It's never over. Nate stood, walked to the wall, and took down Tobias's revolver. The gun he had hung there 40 years ago, promising never to use it again. He loaded it with steady hands. What are we going to do? Agnes asked. Nate looked out the window at Redemption Creek, at the school they had built, at the children playing, at the life they had created from ashes. We protect it, he said simply, again and again, for as long as we have breath. Agnes stood beside him. Then we protect it together. Outside, a stranger rode slowly down Main Street, well-dressed, silver-haired, watching everything with cold, calculating eyes. He stopped in front of the school, looked up at the sign Thornwood Academy, founded 1888, and smiled. The war was not over. It was just beginning again.